I can't tell you how happy it makes me to see all of you. I know many of you, and I don't know some of you, and so I'm looking forward to making some new friends today. And today is really special to me for two reasons. The first reason is that it's important for us to celebrate the accomplishments and progress that the participants have made in the challenge so far. All of you are doing such a great job, and this is just the beginning of the ultimate impact that we can all have on improving the sustainability of the district. And it takes all of us to make the kind of changes in our behavior and our choices in order to have the city that we envision for our future. The second reason is that we have the opportunity to share with you one of the country's leading experts on developing social impact games, Professor Lindsay Grace. Lindsay will help each of you create more engaging, compelling, and fun ways for all of us to achieve more with the time and energy we spend on moving your sustainability agenda forward. Sustainability can get sort of a bad rap sometimes, I think, for being too serious and burdensome, and it's easier to put off for another day or make it someone else's responsibility. But if we're employing some of the gamification techniques that Lindsay will introduce us to, I think we can make people think of sustainability as fun. And so I'd like to turn it over to Professor Grace. Thanks.
Great, well thank you guys. Can everybody hear me clearly enough? Great, all right. I'm gonna warn you that I have a tremendous number of slides that I go through very quickly. It's my usual presentation style. And we're probably gonna break in very quickly, just so that we can continue the program as scheduled. But I thought I would just start first by outlining who I am, and then I'm basically going to give you an overview of what social impact games do and how to employ play. And then I will give you a few next steps in case you're interested in taking this further than this workshop. So very quickly, it's useful to know who I am. My name is Lindsay Grace. I've been making games since these were popular. Does anyone recognize this? 5 1/4 diskette. This is one of the first games I made as a kid. I've been teaching games and interactive media for 12 years, and I've actually directed 2 programs that the Princeton Review ranked as top 25 in the country. As director of the American University Game Lab, a lot of my responsibility is in making sure that we run our curriculum and we run our studio. So our curriculum is a graduate degree in an MA in game design, and then we run a studio. The MA in game design, as I mentioned, was actually ranked right between Abertay University in Dundee, Scotland, and Texas A&M as a top games program graduate level. All right, we do all kinds of crazy, interesting things. I don't know if any of you got a chance to see this last year. We, along with MagFest out in Baltimore, brought 4,000 people to the Smithsonian American Art Museum for what we call a pop-up arcade. Basically, locally made independent games were available for play. We also do things like our Jolt initiative. So I was actually in LA 2 days ago presenting at the Online News Association conference, and we got a $250,000 grant from the Knight Foundation to investigate how we can help news spread through game design. Likewise, we've done all kinds of other initiatives in order to help the local community, and we do things like a diversity summit. We've also been featured in a variety of news outlets as varied as things like Bangkok Post and USA Today to PBS Media Shift and Al Jazeera. As an example of the kind of projects we do within our studio, just about this month, actually, not even a month ago, we announced a project that we've started with some funding from the NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health. And largely what we're doing is we are engaged in trying to help treat anxiety through games. So these are very sort of serious topics. We've also been partnering for the last year with the Educational Testing Services. You may know them as the assessment folks in the standardized testing world, and we've been working through that as well. And we've been doing 2 projects with them, one on cross-cultural competency and the other is on what I'm calling microgames. I speak a lot, so I've spoken at the Game Developers Conference and South by Southwest. I've spoken at what we call the Games for Change Foundation's festival, Games for Change. and the East Coast Games Conference, the Society of News Design, and a variety of sort of local spaces like Adler Planetarium in Chicago and the American Red Cross. Little arrow is me at the national headquarters of the American Red Cross. I also appear on TV and radio on things like Al Jazeera The Stream. I was just on Kojo Namdi show if you're based in DC last Tuesday, Text Tuesday. So when I talk about games, or when games come up, there's always this sort of fundamental question, what is he talking about? So I thought I would lay that out for you. Most people expect me to talk or wax nostalgic about things like Pong. Does anybody recognize this game? Just a few. Or talk about Scrabble, because lots of people play Scrabble, or Uno, or Connect 4, or they start thinking of game characters they know, like Pac-Man, or Super Mario Brothers, or they start talking about what their teens are playing and tell me about Halo. Or they say, I've got Angry Birds on my phone, does that count? But generally, what I like to do is lay out a foundation and help people understand who actually plays games and why games are so engaging. So sometimes you're surprised to find out that 59% of Americans play video games, which is, I think, a pretty large population, and that the industry itself is worth $21.5 billion, or that the average age of a player is 35 years old. It's also important to recognize that it's almost a 50-50 split amongst men and women in terms of who's playing games. All that's to help you understand that people spend a lot of time playing games. So let's look at a case study so we can see how much time people really are spending. So this is Angry Birds. Who's heard of it? Just a few. Okay. All right. Arguably the #1 app of all time. And what's interesting about it is you calculate how much time is spent. It turns out to be about 200 million minutes per day. So all of those players spending their 5-minute sessions turns out to 200 million minutes per day. And I'd like you to think about how awesome it would be if we could take that energy and use it to solve problems, right? Which is one of my areas of research. It's also a big industry, right? So $1 billion USD, which basically makes it about the same size as JetBlue. So the company that owns Rovio is worth the same size as an airline, or worth the same amount as an airline. And the next thing is people usually assume that these games are overnight successes, and this is my first game design tenet for you. Rovio made 51 unsuccessful games before they launched Angry Birds. It is very common within games to understand that you can make lots of mistakes because you learn more from your mistakes than you do from your success. We embrace that. We're okay with the ambiguity of failure. So, the idea is always that we iterate and re-practice our art. So my whole sort of research area is about understanding what we can do with all that game power, all that time we spend going through games, making games, engaging in games. And so it's obvious that we can foster community, which I think is quite resonant for the challenges that you face, keep people engaged, we can inspire empathy. So this game is Darfur is Dying. How many of you have heard of this game? So Darfur is Dying is a game basically about the conflict in Darfur, and you are one of 8 lives, which is each life is represented by a family member, and your goal is to avoid the Janjaweed militia simply to collect water. So very sort of serious and heavy topic, released on MTV networks. We also have games about improving habits. So this is The Great Piggy Bank Adventure by Disney. And Dumb Ways to Die, the Australian campaign, also has a game. And this campaign was largely centered on making sure that people were being careful around train tracks. But this game did very well. And then my other example is actually a standard sort of gamification. So this is the Nissan Leaf, fully electric car. And one of the things they introduced when they first introduced the car was a kind of leaderboard where you could see your power consumption compared to all the other people in your community. So as you played, you kind of leveled up, as you can see here, and you can see there's a little trophy at the end. And then the other game that I'd like to talk about is a co-op, which is a game to encourage people to do good in the world. So people earn these cards and then trade these cards in order to support each other. I wanted to actually talk to you about how these games are effective and what you could actually do yourselves to employ this. The key to effective social impact design is really about what we call play. So all of you know play in some way, and recognize it, but there's been a tremendous amount of research in the last 20 to 30 years on how to effectively employ play and the secret of play. And ultimately, the important thing here for this audience is this notion that play is practice in a laboratory. So if you look at developmental psychology, if you look at the anthropological background, what you'll see is that there is lots of practice as benefit. So if you think about games like tag, you're really playing hunted and hunter, which is a very practical exercise for the last several hundred years. If you look at games like Simon Says, it's explicitly used as a way to help children develop impulse control. So these games are designed to help us practice as simulations. These games work as very low cost, very low investment simulations. So a quick quiz, make sure you're still awake. Who's this? Woohoo! The Monopoly guy is usually what people say. And so what's interesting about Monopoly that people may not necessarily recognize is this idea that it's a persuasive game. This game was explicitly designed to persuade players. So many of you know Monopoly. And who has played Monopoly? Okay. If you haven't, try it. What's the goal of Monopoly?
Make money.
Making money. I love how our people are like, I know that goal. It's sort of a real estate monopoly, right? And you have to ask yourself, okay, fine, so there's ways that I get a real estate monopoly as Monopoly instructs. And you have to ask yourself, what else does Monopoly teach us? So I'm going to give you a couple of things. It teaches us, for example, that cheap real estate is always cheap real estate, right? Once you have Baltic Avenue, it's only going to go up so much. Or that taxes are bad. Or that owning the whole neighborhood is best. Or that you can buy your way out of jail. Or that jail is really just a roll of the dice. It's not that you did anything wrong, you just landed at the wrong place at the wrong time. And then you ask yourself, well, how does a seemingly innocuous game end up being full of so many values? Does anybody know? Because it's a persuasive game, right? It was explicitly designed. So the person who designed the original Monopoly is a woman named Lindsay. And she designed this game with one explicit goal. She was trying to help people understand the trap of land ownership and how it impoverished individuals. So she was a fan of something called Georgist economics, and the idea was, I'm going to make a game to help people understand the stuff that they couldn't understand if I just talked to them in this format and just lectured over and over again about Georgist economics. And so persuasive play is really games designed to change a player's interests, activities, opinions, or behavior. And this is my explicit space within game design. So the next question is, all right, great, I'm sold, I want to make a game, how do you do it? The simplest way to think about a game is to think of a game as structured play. That's all it is. So a game designer structures your play. Does everybody in this room know how to play?
Yeah.
Hopefully? Yeah. You've done it once, at least. Otherwise, developmental psychologists would say you did not mature properly. So I'm going to give you a very simple how-to in designing games. So it's your turn, and I'm going to give you your game design primer. So keep in mind, I typically teach 4 to 2 year programs. I'm going to try and decant that into 30 minutes for you. So you can go gamify your activities. So rule 1 is that games are about doing. So every time you design a game, you have to ask yourself, what am I asking the player to do? Because that's why they're playing your game. You might be asking them to run, you might be asking them to collect things, you might be asking them to do all sorts of stuff. So let's start with toy-based design, because I think it's the simplest space for someone who's never done game design before. If games are structured play, then we understand that this is a toy. You play with toys, and you structure that play, how I use the toy, through a game. Very simple taxonomy. Toy, play, game. If you know what a toy is and you know how to play, you're pretty much there. All right, so really all you're doing with a game, structuring the play, is figuring out what you do with a toy. So playing catch, shooting balls, playing billiards, or rolling it in a maze. The idea is that you are always just designing the interaction. So your activity 1, in the small groups at your table, is that I would like you guys to grab one of the toys in the middle of the table. Go for it. You've got index cards in front of you. I want you to list, and we're going to do this a little faster since we were a little slow this morning. You've got 1.5 minutes to list all the things you can do with your toy. And you guys can brainstorm together. You could take one toy on that table and say, all right, what do you guys think I can do with this?
I have way more ideas for the frog.
Okay.
All right, you can play it.
Let's hold off for a minute, guys. You're going to have lots of activities today. And I'm going to move the time ahead a little bit. Did anyone have a cool thing to do with their toy? Anyone want to share their...
Yes.
Yeah, let's hear it. I could tell there was something going on because people were like,
Yeah,
ooh.
so
Yep.
Mary Lynn suggested that the top be used as a fishing lure.
Ah,
Well, that one. Oh.
fishing with a top. Okay, good. Anyone else?
Suggested that this could be used for blue bubbles.
Ah, okay, good. Adaptation, yep. There's another hand over there.
Use the yo-yo to hypnotize someone?
Okay, oh, I like hypnotize. Right, so the idea here is you have to ask yourself two things. Let's say that you have no idea where you're starting and you need some object to help you understand where the opportunities for play are. So the great thing about those three examples was they were explicitly non-traditional uses of the object itself. And that in itself can be playful because it takes on new characteristics. So the idea here is to, in toy-based design, is to start thinking about how the subject or the thing that you use within your game are actually going to facilitate you finding playfulness. So the wonkiness, the awkwardness of a toy can actually be part of its fun. So let's move ahead. The first thing you just did was you came up with playful ways to use the objects in your space. And these are toys, so they should be very easy, but ultimately you don't need to use a toy to find play. So you center your play around the toy itself. This is toy-based design. So it says, I have this one thing I must play with, and I need to find playful and interesting ways to use it, like hypnotizing people or blowing bubbles with a paddle ball. So the next thing is always, how do you convert that play into a game? So you have a list of activities now that are all things you can playfully do with your toy. And the way to convert that is fairly simple. You need to think of two basic design principles, and these will help you structure something from a play activity toward a game. So the first is that game design itself is a set of interesting problems. People often misunderstand what we do as game designers and say that it's about choice. We aren't giving you any choices. We're giving you problems, and those problems are the basis for our game design. And the second is, as I mentioned, games are about doing. I know it sounds obvious, but I think when you think about what you're offering players, you're offering an activity or a thing to do. So again, interesting problems and doing. So what I often do when I frame game design is I tell people, all you have to do is answer these three questions and you've got a good game, or at least you've got a game. I can't promise it's good. You need a goal. It's the first thing you should be asking as a player. Why am I doing this? You need an obstruction to the goal. What's the thing that's getting in my way from doing explicitly what I want? And then the means to achieving it. So if we take blowing bubbles with a paddle ball, the goal is to make a great bubble. The obstruction might be the fact that there's still a ball on it and it's really hard to blow bubbles with it. And then the means may be that you have 3 people helping you to blow those bubbles. Okay. More explicitly, anyone recognize this game? Super Mario Brothers, right? One of the all-time classics. And so if we were to frame that same goal, obstruction, and means, we have goal, save the princess, obstruction, the distance, the platforms themselves, the enemies in each level, and then the means, which is running, jumping, and shooting. That's the way you achieve your goals. So we could do this with a bunch of activities. If we think about obstruction critically, it's often your character or your representation of self in-game is something and needs blank. So your character is hungry and needs food is something like Pac-Man. Your character is weak and needs strength. Those are the power pellets. Your character is sad and needs passion. This is a game called Elude that's about depression. And so you sort of collect these things that make you feel better, and sometimes you sink down into the earth and then you come back up. Your character might be troubled and need resolution, or angry and need revenge, lonely and need company. ultimately, the obstruction is the problem itself. So if you look at Super Mario Brothers again, you can see those are all just a series of problems. How to get there, how do I avoid dying, etc. So designers create problems, and designers offer the solutions. So there's a problem, character in my way, I can bonk them and move on. So the solutions themselves are the way we meet our needs. And means, as I'd mentioned before, is the solution. So if we think of very simple sports, these are all ball games with a couple of simple toys, a bat and a ball, and then an environment, the field. But we play them very differently because we have the rules that structure the play. That's how games are designed. So if we think about the means, it's really that what designers do is they give us something we call game verbs. So a game verb in a game might be jump. Has anyone ever seen this game before? It's an endless runner. Essentially what happens is your character is always running, and all you have to do is press one button and jump. But if you fail to jump at the right time, you fail. So very simple. It was Cannonball. It's a very simple mechanic. We can connect running and jumping, and maybe you recognize Donkey Kong. We can connect running, jumping, and sliding, and we have Temple Run, which is also a very popular game. Running, jumping, and shooting, we've seen 100 times. Lots of first-person shooters. That's Doom in the corner. And then I'm actually going to skip these for brevity. So we have a bunch of verbs in the world that we can employ. So I've transitioned from something we call toy design towards verb-based design, which is very useful for social impact play. So the idea is to offer people great solution verbs. So this was a universe of verbs, matching, guiding, repairing, building. And those are often very satisfying verbs for people. People like to create things. And so there's a theory called the Rhetoric of progress, that when people feel like they're doing something good, they continue to do more and more of that. All right, so let's think about the problems you're currently trying to solve. How are you going to affect people's sustainability practice? We're going to try exercise 2. And I'm going to let you start individually, and then we're going to come back to groups. So what I'd like you guys to do is think about a single goal that you have. And so this goal might be encouraging people to drive to work less often and take public transportation. And then I'd like you to come up with a list of solution verbs. So you just came up with a list of play verbs for a specific toy. And that was fine. But now you've got a more difficult goal, which is offering a series of solutions. So in this case, I might say, all right, well, what can I do within the domain of having people bike to work that would be rewarding? Or share a ride, or skip to work. Literally skip. Not skip work, but skip to work. So what I'd like you guys to do, and I don't think we need 5 minutes, I'd say probably need 2, is just on a piece of paper or on your phone or whatever mobile device you like, write a list of solution verbs, things that you think would help with that particular problem. So come up with your single goal and then write some verbs. All right, anyone care to share some of their solutions, their goal and their solution verbs? Yes?
The goal is to reduce waste from all that stuff.
Yep.
So there's the refuse, reduce, reuse, recycle.
Yep.
Another one. So the avoid, decide, give up, plan, think, research, know, prepare.
So let's take give up. Could anyone imagine a scenario in which it would be satisfying to give some things up? Yes?
Wait.
Sorry? Wait is your game verb? It's kind of funny, I actually have a game around waiting where you're explicitly rewarded for waiting.
No, I mean.
Oh, give up wait. Oh, okay. Yeah, there you go. So there's something that's rewarding. Very nice. Okay. What about in this domain specifically? So in sustainability.
Tie it to charity. Give.
Okay.
Give things that you don't need to somebody else.
Absolutely, right. So that's a really obvious and simple one. So perfect, exactly. So we could say, great, I've got a lot of stuff and I'd like to give it up to people who actually use it.
I'm sorry, I was going to say that actually I think that the weight loss or the fitness issue does tie into sustainability when you're trying to do things like get people to bike to work.
Okay. All right, I missed that connection, I'm sorry. Okay, so here's what I'd like you guys to do. That was a great example. What I'd like to do is take those, the current goal that you have, and frame them as a game. And understanding that it may not be a good game yet, but we're going to fix that. So take your player goal, take your obstruction to the goal, which you're going to create if it doesn't already exist, like weight, and then give us a means to overcoming that. So your means is often going to be your verb list that you just made. So you've got 1 already and 3, and start to play with 2. How can I impede people or play upon the existing obstacles in life playfully in a way that would be satisfying? Once you do that, we're going to share it amongst each other, and then it's all been on It's partly doing this line up that Okay, I'm going to cut you off because this is the super speed round game design. We've got to pack in a whole set of practices in game design in a short amount of time. So you guys just wrote, if you've never done a game concept statement before, you just did your first game concept statement. So you can now go to the makers of Halo and say you can be employed. So the concept statement effectively from a production end helps us situate the whole team and say, here's what we're making. So you just did that in a very short amount of time. The truth is, on most large game projects, we might do this 30 to 50 times and then choose from that hit list. And when I work with clients, I tend to say, here's 25 ideas I really like. Let's see how they mesh with what you like. But does anybody have one they'd like to share? Any epiphanies? Yes?
I'd love to share mine.
Great.
It's actually getting our residents to sort of change their day-to-day behavior, especially in the sense of unplugging small appliances.
Okay.
And the value of doing that from an energy efficiency perspective.
Yep.
So what I did was to say the goal is actually the action of unplugging every time that you use it.
Yep.
And then, of course, the obstruction is remembering to do so.
Yep.
And then the means is, how do you overcome breaking that habitual habit of not remembering?
Yep.
So.
Great. Yeah, so that's a good frame. And then if we were to think about it as a game, the obvious thing is to do something like give people points every time they remember. So when you walk out the door, you've got a little sheet that says, I unplugged 7 things. Oh, wait, last time I unplugged 8. What did I forget to unplug? Great. What else? Everyone else is going to be shy about that? Yes? This is the not shy
have
table.
one that I'm really thinking about creating.
Yep.
It's just so strange. Eating healthy and drinking water is a big thing for me. So
Okay.
especially drinking water, period. So do you remember the little toys where you had to give it water and everything?
Yeah.
So creating your own avatar where it looks just like you, and then if you eat healthy and you drink water, then this is what you look like. And exercise, this is what you look like. If you don't, this is what you look like. So the goal, right, so it would shrink your body if you don't drink water, and your avatar would really, change daily, how you would do it. So eat healthy, drink water, sticking to it, create an avatar, and what you would do and the point you would gain.
Great, great. And it's that there are a whole population of games that were sort of like pet management games. And the great relationship you have there is this notion that with those games, it has to be consistent. You can't just say, you know what, I'm going to give you 3 gallons of water today, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Right.
And so, encouraging people to do that by seeing a representation of self is a really good way to do that. Great. Anyone else? Yes? And then.
So I had one, my goal was to reduce the fleet car use.
Okay.
And my solution were schedule, share ride, conference calls, or use the metro. But then my instructions were schedule, metro, wanting to be face to face.
Yep. So the schedule is probably the obstruction, right? So I have to look at the resource, and it's a limited use resource. So in that case, what you want to do is you want to find a verb that is quite satisfying. So it might be things like fill holes, get multiple use. And so what happens is I look at the schedule and I go, oh wow, if I just move my appointment to this time, then I get twice as much credit because I'm driving with someone. And so the idea is to make sure that you are, again, games are about doing, so you're trying to find activities, verbs that people are satisfied in doing. So it's a sort of a satisfying way. And the other thing to note with verbs is they can also be things that take away. So it could be that I'm using something less, and that is considered a resource, right? So just like gasoline, sort of I spend it, but if I end the month with more gasoline than everybody else, I win. Okay, great, thank you. Oh, there's one more. Yes.
Yeah, mine was food waste, and I kind of boiled it down to 2 verbs that have modifiers, so more and less, so cook more, save more.
Yep.
Eat out less, use less fat, and lazy. But the obstructions that I kind of came up with, time, friends, random life happening, and just laziness. And
Okay.
I see just a weird sim-like game where you have just these things that, because the Sims are very, you can do whatever you want.
Yep.
It's very meant to be open source, but to kind of control that a bit more where it throws these obstructions at you, your friend calling you, asking you to go out to eat when you have a fridge full of food,
Yep.
and you have to make the decision at that point. So.
Or you could reverse that if you're trying to encourage positive behavior and encourage people to be the friend that calls and says, hey, why don't we come over and cook this great, healthy lifestyle dish together? And then they achieve, right? So actually that was part of the model, and I went by this game very quickly. But the game of Koha, so you understand the history, it was really quite fascinating. So a game designer in the professional game space, think someone who develops a game like Call of Duty, was a producer, and he'd been doing that job for so many years that he was just destroying his body. Think lots of Mountain Dew and pizza. And he quit the industry and made a Koha. And what he did with the Koha was he was trying to encourage people to behave more positively. So he created these cards, and he actually just left these cards out in the world. And they were sort of pay-it-forward cards. And so you would get one, and then you'd look at a website and say, well, what was this card about? You'd find out that you could generate your own cards as long as you had done enough activities. So it was self-reported, but eventually you earned enough currency in the game world to build your own cards, to have people doing the other things you think people should be doing to pay it forward. So I think it's a nice full story in that he comes from this space that wasn't necessarily about helping the world, and then he decided to construct this game as a response to it. It's a really interesting story. And actually, when he presents sometimes, he'll actually show his weight change because he was really unhealthy and then he got really healthy. And it was partly from moving out of the industry. The game industry can be quite demanding. Okay, so you've written a concept solution, or you've written a kind of concept statement for a game, and I've had you go through that a little bit, and we shared. And the next question is always, all right, so I've got this concept statement, how do I know whether or not it's good? Well, the way you do that is a variety of processes, but I'm going to talk about one from Tracy Fullerton at USC, one of the older game programs in the country. It's about 15 years old at this point. Yeah. And this notion of play-centric design is very simple. So what you do is you start with your game concept, and then get ready for it. Get ready. You play. And as you play, you go, huh, well that was kind of boring, or that was really fun, and I didn't expect this part of it to be fun, but that's the thing that people seem to gravitate towards. And you iterate in on this spiral of starting the game, playing the game, refining the game, all the way to a point at which you can say, I need to make a decision, do I continue on this route or do I change the game? And that's all to tell you that one of the ways that game makers make good games is they play. But we play smart. And what playing smart means is that we look at a couple of really key concepts in game design. So this is essentially what we call the flow channel. Ever play a game and get so wholly engaged in the game that you've noticed nothing else in the world? Even might have just happened to you this morning. So the idea is that the flow channel is the space that exists between boredom and anxiety. Anxiety is, oh my god, this is too hard, I can't do this anymore. Which I think a lot of people see in a lot of challenges in their lives. And then the other side is boredom. I don't really care either way if I play this game or not. And to get more formal, it's actually from something called positive psychology. There's a map of how engaging or engrossing your game is. So this is the amount of skill that it requires at the bottom, and this is the amount of challenge. So if it is a low skill, low challenge activity, players are apathetic. They could care less. If it is a high skill, but low challenge, then you just kind of, it's bored. Sure, I can do this, but I'm not particularly engaged in it. And worst case scenario is you might have very little skill and you are required to do something very hard, to which you say, I can't handle this, please, you're averse from the game. Your goal is up here, to constantly readjust the amount of skill it requires, at the same time upping the challenge. Really good games can do this dynamically, so that someone who has played the game for years can have fun with someone who has played the game for 3 minutes. Anyone ever play like Wii Mario Kart? So Mario Kart's a really good example of this. It's designed so that a 5-year-old can play with a 70-year-old and a 30-year-old, and they all have fun. And it gives you these little power-ups so that if you're performing poorly, you actually get a little boost, so you're still in the race. So it's a car racing game that we call it rubber banding, pulls everybody together. So that's Csikszentmihalyi's flow chart. Don't try to spell that. If you just look up flow and positive psychology, you'll find it. That's flow. So your exercise 2.1 is to group up, because we do find that game design works really well when you talk with other individuals. And you're going to try and find a flow state in your game. Now, ultimately, I think for a lot of the ideas we're going to have here, you're not going to be able to try them out right now. Let's go through our schedule and figure out whether or not people can do a ride share. But what I'd like you guys to do is just talk about it a little and think about ways that you could adjust the skill needed and the challenge needed. Because sometimes with these game designs, if you're gamifying something, what you might be doing is saying, you know what, I'm going to give you a whole lot of challenges up front, and people look at it and go, wow, that's just like 18 things I got to do. No thanks. That's high anxiety. You've given them too much at once. But you can say, congratulations, you've matriculated. Now you get a new challenge. And that's a very easy way to structure it so people are more satisfied. Okay?
So like, kind of teaching things and get a chance to like experience. So it's like to broaden your horizon. So you can do the same thing maybe with like practices like.
All right, guys, we're gonna wind it up. Does anybody feel like sharing? You don't have to. In case you forgot what you're doing, you're trying to find flow state. Does anyone have any little tactics on finding flow state? Yes, in the back. Yep.
We have a game over here about paper.
Okay.
And trying to reduce its use.
Yep.
So what we decided to create was scarcity, so everybody gets 50 sheets per day to print.
Yep.
Oh, wow.
If you use it the next day, you get to level up, and then you have 100 sheets.
Awesome.
So if you don't use the sheets that you print, you can sell them, and you can get money.
Great. Great idea. Now everyone else is like, I like that shit. That was so good. But that's basically perfect. You're creating an economy and you're balancing that economy, and then there's this sort of question of what do you do when people have 300 sheets? Do they need some reward, but that first step is great, right? There's clear reward, I have utility, and you've matched the verb, earn paper, to the thing I need, which is paper. So that works out well. And if I earn more paper by using less paper, which is great. Okay, see, they got it, good job. All right, so the next question is sort of how do you inspire change? And so I want you to remember a couple of things we've already talked about. Games are about doing. When you do, you are practicing. That's why we play. That's why psychologists say we play. That's why we play through history. We're practicing something. So in order to affect behavior, the ideal is explicitly that. You want to encourage people to practice doing what you want them to do. So the idea is really to make sure that you're giving them useful, successful solution verbs, the things they are going over and over in the game. So in reality, if we want to change the way people play, we have to look critically at the verbs. There's more than 30,000 English verbs, so you've got plenty to choose from. I actually did a very sort of academic analysis, linguistic analysis of the verbs that are most common in games right now, in mobile games at least. And it's kind of interesting. A lot of them have to do with acquisition, which I think in some ways helps you understand why people are compelled to play games. I've acquired more of something, so using, get, having, and taking. And then the other most common category is earning, creating, and making. So earning is what we just heard, right? You earn paper, but the only way you earn paper is by using less of it. It's really quite nice. So, and as I mentioned before, there's a very large universe of solution verbs out there for you. So just so you get some sense as to how these are employed practically, we have, these are verbs of empathy. We have this game called Lim, which is very, very simple. So if you actually wanted to make a game, there are tools I'll show you in a minute to make super simple games like this. So in this game, you are a block. And as you move through space, your block is amongst other blocks. And these blocks have specific colors. If you want, you can press the spacebar to change colors to match the other blocks. But sometimes you can't quite match the other blocks and they bully you. They literally push you off the screen. So what you're perpetually doing is trying to sort of blend in when you really can't and move through the space. So this is sort of a social impact game about bullying and about the odd person out. Okay, another game I think is really interesting. The focus is kind of dark, but the focus here is Rwanda, and you have one action. The one verb you can do is calm. So you have a baby in your hands, and there is a militia outside your door, and you have to press letters at the right time to keep the baby calm, so that they don't hear you inside. So it's supposed to elicit an emotional response from you. I show you these games to remind you that it's all not Super Mario Brothers and Pac-Man. And then you have games like verbs of affection. So this is actually one of my game designs from a couple of years back. This is called Big Hugging. You play it by hugging a 32-inch teddy bear. And you can give about 12 degrees of hugs. And as you hug him, he hits obstacles on screen. And so if he hits an obstacle, you've got to give him just the right hug to get past that obstacle. I thought it'd be nice to give you something nice in between, because it's also important to notice that what you allow the player to do is as important as what you don't. So I focused most of the verbs on actions, and so this is more of a toy than an actual game. But this is September 12th. What happens in September 12th is you see this Middle Eastern town, city, and you have a reticle. You can actually fire a missile when you see a terrorist. If you fire a missile at a terrorist, you create quote-unquote collateral damage. That collateral damage spreads. So you create more terrorists every time you fire a missile. So it's an argument, a kind of rhetoric about what you should be doing. All right, so when you're evaluating your verbs, what you're trying to do is ask yourself whether or not they're enticing or interesting to players. And to do that, you just need to understand the basic needs and the way that players will accomplish their goals. From a technological perspective, this might be on a computer, it might be on a mobile phone. By the way, neat fact, the UN reported about 2 years ago that more people own mobile phones than toilets. Which is probably a sad state of affairs, but all the same, there's some knowledge for you. And then even in public areas. So I like to remind you that some of these games do not require any technology at all. Right? They can be card games, they can be what we call urban games or playground games, where people can just go out and do some of these activities as practice. Likewise, they could be done at a conference or seminar. I'm going to skip this step because we're running out of time, but ultimately you're asking yourself whether or not your verbs are interesting. So I've done some bad games, so you understand that we learn from our mistakes. So I had a game about a revolution in Africa, and I gave people all kinds of verbs, and one of them was canvas, and that turns out to be a horrible, horrible verb because nobody wants to cold call the game. Which is essentially what I did, because I was like, oh, well, this is part of the thing they did, so we have to go out there, and it was just awful. So it's okay to make some mistakes. We're going to skip that as well, and just want to remind you to start with your goal, because that's essentially what people understand as the game itself, and always ask what verbs are satisfying. So definitely got to cut this short. If you'd like, what I can do is I'll tweet out this, which we did. This is a sort of a subset of a workshop I ran with 2 other faculty about 2 years ago at the Games for Change Foundation. And this particular sheet is a nice one to help you understand some of the cool game verbs you can employ, largely in the digital space, but they can work elsewhere. I mostly work in digital games these days. And if you were interested in making them digital, I want to let you know of a couple of things. First, there's this thing called the Global Game Jam. It's designed for everyone. People who've made games before, people who've never made a game in their entire lives. It happens in January. I happen to be the vice president of it. And it's an international organization. We're an international nonprofit based out of California. So in a single weekend, all over the world, last year we got 28,000 people to get together, and on Friday they found a theme for their game. Everyone was given the exact same theme, and they made a game in a weekend. Some people choose to sleep there, some people tend to go home. And that involved 78 countries that made 5,400 games. Sometimes when people think about digital games, they think they need the $30 million budget and the 3 years that it takes to make a Call of Duty. They don't. Some of these games are really great. So you basically run a local version of the Global Game Jam. So we ran one here at American University, and that was, those were our participants. They use tools like Game Salad, which is completely free, and 5th graders use it. I'm not exaggerating. 5th graders who aren't necessarily high tech competent, or Construct 2, also starting at about 5th grade. And they work really well. And that's all to tell you, you can make a game in a weekend. Who's ever heard of Cards Against Humanity? This was the predecessor to the Global Game Jam was the Nordic Game Jam. This was made at the Nordic Game Jam. This game did not exist on a Friday, and by Sunday it existed. It's that simple. It was originally designed as a print-to-play game, and now it's sort of one of the things to play. You can spend a little longer. So we make these kind of games very quickly. So this is a game we just made as part of a project with an unnamed news agency. Because NDA, I can't tell you everything. Short version is we wanted to make a game that critiqued the dilemma in drones. And so this game you have privacy and convenience colliding. So you drive a drone that's supposed to deliver parcels. You pick up your parcels and you cannot violate anyone's privacy. So no flying over anyone, essentially, while you play the game. So you see the dilemma very quickly as you play. I mentioned Big Huggin', and Big Huggin' I made in 5 days. So it's totally reasonable to do. And of course, your games don't have to be digital. So we have this thing called the Jolt Initiative, which I hinted at before, that Knight Foundation work. So this is work that our students did. Notice it's a card game. They did it in front of the museum several days, and the idea was to engage people with, of all things, water consumption. So they had a game that basically, I'm going to give all the rules away. We have information online if you go to jolt.augamelab.com. But with this game, people played, and they got these cards that told them how much water an individual food item cost to produce. So a soy burger, a hamburger, a bowl of rice, etc. And then all 3 players, when there were 3 players, were trying to create a meal that was the lowest water consumption. And so the game was well received, and they continue to play it. We'll actually be going back to the museum next month. And so there's just sort of overviews of the game. And there are all kinds of other ones that are really interesting. Mary Flanagan's a great designer out of Dartmouth, and she has a lot of games that are not obviously about social impact, but explicitly designed under social impact. And Buffalo is one of them. There's a couple. Anyway, that's all I had. I hope that was useful. If you have any last questions, let me know. Otherwise, I gotta fly out of here. Yes?
How long something should take?
Yeah, someone just asked me that on Saturday. No. The short version is no, but it depends on the kind of impact you're trying to create. So my big bias is towards short and sweet, as you can probably tell by my presentation style, and very directed. But the difference is, if you're doing something that's short and sweet, you've got to make sure that it's also satisfying. Otherwise, people go, why bother? Yes?
I just have a general comment. And again, thank you so much, Patty, for having me here. I never thought that a game would be so intricate, and I'm so happy that I'm here and you've sort of exposed the intricacies, the whole technology that go into making games. I'm impressed. I'm really impressed. I'm excited.
Great.
Hey.